Welcome to School of PE podcast. I'm your host, Chris Miller, and I'm so glad that you could join me this week. We are going to discuss topics about FE, PE, and SC, and we're also going to answer questions that will help students prepare for their exams. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the SOPE podcast. I'm Chris Miller, and today I got a Julienne Bautista with us off of the East Coast, so let's welcome her aboard. Julienne, thank you for coming in, spending some time with us. So if you would, just kind of introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background of who you are.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure being here and speaking to your audience. I'm Julienne Bautista. I'm a stormwater environmental engineer for the District of Columbia. And what I do and how I ended up here is I, went to school for a bachelor's in history. And then I decided I really like cities and I like how cities are built and infrastructure. So I went back to school for a master's in urban planning and a master's in environmental engineering. Wow. And then I ended up going to DC and, being really involved in their water quality regulations here. And I implement stormwater regulations for new construction and renovation. It's a lot of work. It's really busy. All the cities in the United States are busily constructing as much as they can. And DC is also of that nature. One of the few things you'll see when you come here is tons of cranes in the sky. You go to the National Mall or you fly into DC, you'll still see cranes. And it's like crazy how much construction is happening.
No, I agree. And you're right. It's everywhere. I mean, I was in LA not too long ago and cranes there too.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you kind of mentioned the path that you took. And, as I talk to different engineers throughout these podcasts, I find a lot of them take a different, they don't go to, hey, I'm going to be engineering right out of high school and they know exactly where they're going. So it's kind of cool that you went from history to urban planning and then now you're an environmental engineer. Holy moly, that is quite the path. But what it also shows is that you don't need to know exactly what you want to do right off the bat. I think one of the great things about engineering is that it's such a diverse and broad field that, every day is different. You can go down many different paths, right? You could be a civil engineer, and within civil, there's many paths you can do. And then you have environmental, all that fun stuff. So, we have an interesting topic, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Stormwater Regulation. That's a mouthful.
Yes.
But I guess I should start off by asking, what is a watershed?
A watershed, it's a land area that topographically water when we have rainfall or rivers or streams where water falls on the land and then drains to a point. So that point could be to a creek, it could be to a stream, it could be to a river. For urban areas, that could be a stormwater sewer shed. So it could be a catch basin or inlet point. So sometimes when you talk about watersheds, you want to kind of specify, what the watershed characteristics are. So like if you're in the mountains, you might have a different type of watershed than you would for the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River has an expansive watershed. So Chesapeake Bay watershed actually has portions of New York State, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. So it's massive.
Yeah, that's big. Well, I appreciate you explaining. That's interesting to know. I didn't know that. So that's kind of interesting. And yeah, specification is probably good. So now that we kind of define watershed, I guess the next place to go is, what is stormwater?
Stormwater is typically either rainwater or melted snow that runs off streets, lawns, and other sites that are publicly accessible. So, think roadways, think sidewalks. DC, we kind of have a very expansive definition of stormwater.
Oh, very good. So, before we started the podcast today, we kind of, we're just chit chatting, and I learned, I said, I saw that surfboard behind you and found out you're from LA, that you moved to the East Coast. So, I'm also from LA. And so, I'm used to a different type of, I guess, a pollutant or like air pollution, right?
Right. Yes.
I grew up by Santa Barbara, and my dad got transferred to Southern California when I was like in high school. And people were like, you're going to be able to taste the air when you move down to San Bernardino. I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no taste, but yeah, that smog is ridiculous. So, I'm sure being from LA, you understand that too. I remember coming into the valley, coming through Thousand Oaks down the 101. You're like, holy cow, what is that? Just that cloud that's sitting over LA. Is it fog? I'm like, it can't be fog. It's 2 p.m.
Right.
So, so this is kind of interesting. So, what are some of the pollutants that would be found in stormwater fed water sources?
So we typically, the District of Columbia and the Chesapeake Bay watershed areas, we typically look at sediments
Okay.
and total nitrogen and total phosphorus. And so some of the regulations that, that we look at, try to look at treating or capturing those sediments before they go into our water bodies, and then total phosphorus and total nitrogen, treating them and using them in kind of a more of a vegetative practice before infiltrating or running off into our water bodies.
That makes sense. So, when people talk about pollution, whether it be water, or air, they're always talking about the consequences or ways that they can reduce pollution. Like, for example, maybe out in LA or even some in New York where there's a lot of traffic, emissions is a big issue, right? Reducing emissions. But, people are like, well, what are some of the consequences? So, let's take a look at, the water sources. So what are some of the consequences, of not removing or not reducing some of these pollutants that are existing in the water sources?
So for DC, we have two components to our water stormwater regulations. We have a detention practice and a retention requirement. So detention means slowing down water before going into the stormwater system or into our water bodies. And retention practices are when you use water to infiltrate into green systems like grass or plant or landscape irrigation or bioretention systems. So some of the consequences of not capturing stormwater is that the water is moving very fast. It can erode, rivers and creeks and streams, possibly damaging air, people's homes that live next to those resources, or, bringing sediment and high pollutants to those water bodies, thus impacting, aquatic habitat. And so that's what we're trying to prevent is, making sure that people keep their homes, that they're not, living on eroded hillsides, and then also making sure that our water bodies are safe and healthy and usable for recreation for folks. Some of the things that we try to prevent, is, limiting pesticides going into the water bodies, motor oil from roadways and chemical contaminants. So getting those treated is really helpful. And likewise, the detention, slowing the water down before entering our water bodies kind of helps prevent flooding. Like, interior urban flooding is something that a lot of cities are looking at, because it's not just a normal floodplain that, you see. You have riverine flooding and then you have, ocean flooding, but cities flood too. And that could be because the storm water system is, under capacity.
That makes sense. Thanks for that explanation. So, when you talk about things where you're looking to reduce or control, there's got to be some kind of like best practice, right? So, is there a stormwater best management practice?
I wouldn't just say one best practice. The District of Columbia has a stormwater guidebook that is we have such a large guidebook. It's about 700 pages
Holy cow.
with 13 best management practices. The most commonly used are bioretention systems, permeable pavement. We acknowledge that green roofs can be a stormwater practice. We also encourage stormwater reuse. And for the Chesapeake Bay, which I think is a little unique, we actually acknowledge tree planting and tree preservation as a stormwater practice. That's it's unusual.
Yeah. So, how did that make it into best practice?
You have to go back to some of your watershed hydrology classes where you think about tree canopy capture of water, evapotranspiration, and you just think about like kind of the water budget, right? So like water falls down, how much of it gets captured by the trees, how much of it goes to the root system. And so we acknowledge that trees add to stormwater. They also add to other elements that, come into play when thinking about the environment for cities.
That makes sense. So, whenever I guess you want to maybe reduce or control, a lot of ways that I guess the government agencies can do it is they could either give incentives or there could be penalties. So, what restrictions can be placed on businesses or corporations to help reduce their water pollution?
Oh, so that's really fascinating for the District of Columbia because we actually have very strict regulations. So anytime a developer, private landowner, even district agencies, when they start redeveloping or renovating a project or a building, they will most likely trigger stormwater requirements, which means that they will need to install one of the 13 best management practices that we have listed in our guidance. Those practices have to be maintained over the lifetime of that project or of the existence of that building. So if someone comes in and redevelops it, then they will also trigger a new stormwater management plan. If you are not able to implement any stormwater practices, there's multiple ways that you could do it within the district. So you can install stormwater practices, go into our stormwater retention credit trading market, which is really fascinating. And a kind of a new thing in the United States is that people will voluntarily install stormwater practices to generate a dollar value or a volume that we kind of equate a gallon of water stormwater retained and treated to a dollar value of some sort. So if you were not able to capture, let's say, 10 gallons on your site that you were required to do so, you can purchase that 10 gallons from a voluntary installer.
You're gonna have to explain that a little bit more.
It's kind of like carbon trading.
Yeah.
So like if you're emitting a lot of carbon, someone else is capturing carbon and
Right.
using it. So you go to that person and say, hey, I'm just using too much carbon. I need your help. I will pay you to capture all the carbon that I'm releasing. So that's kind of like the idea behind stormwater retention credits. And then the last option is you pay a fee, and you have to do all three things in perpetuity of the life of the project. So it's very strict.
Wow. So let me ask you this.
Yes.
Because now my curiosity is just piqued here.
I know.
So is there a limit to the amount of credits that you can buy?
You can buy as many credits as you want. I mean, that's up to you. So what we do as a government agency is we set up the market. We help people, go through our guidebook and construct and build these stormwater practices, generate the credits. And then there's going to be the side that is regulated, like the private developers who are like, I can't fit a bioretention. I can't fit a green roof here. I have 10 or 100 gallons that I need to do off site. I will ask these people who voluntarily installed them, say, hey, what's your price? I will purchase that from you.
That's crazy. So do prices fluctuate just like a regular market?
They do, and we don't control the prices.
Okay.
Right? So it all depends on, supply and demand.
That's interesting.
So currently our in lieu fee, so if you don't purchase stormwater retention credits, our fee, I think, is $3.60 per gallon.
Oh, wow.
So, but if you go in the market, some people have it marked all the way down to $1.20 per gallon. So, there's $2.50 or $2 and some change that you're saving there.
Fascinating. Man, I'm telling you, we could do a podcast just on credits.
Then I have to get the rest of my team here. Like, I'm just one cog in that wheel.
That's a nice wheel, though. I like it. So, I guess there's always, I don't know if you want to call it a breaking point or a light bulb goes off in somebody's head, but like, what do you think kind of led to the desire to adapt, a more stringent stormwater regulations?
I think there's been many breaking points, right? The start of EPA during Richard Nixon's, presidency, Ohio and Cuyahoga River. That was really fascinating, and looking at the history of pollutants in water bodies. One big thing that happened in the Chesapeake Bay region was a watershed agreement between all the states in 2014, which said that everyone was committed to implementing a pollution diet via numerous ways, right? And stormwater regulations is one of them. Education and outreach is another. Cities, District of Columbia also has voluntary, residential, school, nonprofit kind of outreach. Like, can you, if you install, a bioretention system, we will help with your water bill, things like that. And so, with that watershed agreement, DC kind of looked at everything that we could do. And it was kind of nice because DC is it's not a city, it's not a state. So our bureaucracy is a little truncated, right? Like if you go to a city and a county and then you have a state level,
right.
Like you have all these hoops to go, like, hey, can we apply for this grant? Goes to the, county office. No, yes, or then it goes to the state office. Oh yeah, you guys totally qualify. But it takes, like, you're going through two layers of bureaucracy, but DC, we're all on the same floor. I am just going to get angry at my colleague being like, why aren't you helping me put this grant out or applying for this grant? So we're all very much huddled together.
Yeah.
And it allows for a lot of innovation and allows for creative thinking. So the stormwater regs are stringent, but we realize that. And we've created multiple options for developers and landowners because we know how important the development community is. And if we don't give them options, our regs would be thrown in the trash bin.
No, I agree. So here's a question. So earlier you mentioned the Chesapeake Bay dumps, I don't know if you call it dumps into, but the watershed funnels into, along with the district, several other states.
Yes.
So how difficult those? So let's say the District of Columbia wants to implement stricter rules about water pollutants being released into the watershed, and some of these other states are like, well, those are too stringent, or they just don't work for us. I mean, the overall goal for everybody is to reduce it in that area, right?
Right.
So how do you monitor and even direct that?
Oh, it's amazing. And I am only one tiny cog in the system. There's something called the Chesapeake Bay Program, which is a consortium of all the states, their environmental quality managers, their stormwater managers, or their floodplain managers. There are multiple work groups, technical working groups, that work together to kind of level the playing field. So some things that you have to do when you work with, multiple stakeholders from different areas of the nation is you have to level the playing field, right? You have to come to a common ground. You have to say, these are the pollutants that we're seeing, agree to that information, right? That's important. And then ask, okay, how are we going to work towards a bettering of that water body or bettering of that stream system. And that process of negotiating is very tough. We come out with lots of research documents. I think when people discuss the funding for EPA kind of research, a lot of it goes to, our state senators and, Congress people will ask for more money for the Chesapeake Bay and say, hey, we need more research money going here because we need to identify multiple ways to inform the public and inform our, environmental managers about how to manage for stormwater, how to manage for wastewater, how to manage for runoff and flooding and any of those occurrences. So negotiating across all of those partners takes a long time, takes a lot of meetings, takes a lot of reviewing documents and, going back and forth with someone. There are some states who are just very no, we don't think it's a problem. And then, we're kind of at a confluence of the Potomac River and Anacostia River in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we see drainage, watershed drainage from Virginia and Maryland, and we can see the direct impacts when it comes to District of Columbia. So we'll see it. And we try to push our neighboring jurisdictions, and Northern Virginia and Maryland surrounding DC, everyone is very similar in mindset. We see these as amenities to the quality of life here. People are out in the river. If it's not safe to be in the river, that is something that we can't, attract people to live in, DC, in Alexandria, and in Arlington, Virginia. And it's, it makes a big impact.
I agree.
Yeah.
Also, like you said, it's hard to attract people to come live in those areas, but also I'd imagine it could affect your tourism as well.
Yes.
People that come out there, I imagine it's a great place to vacation, great place to get out on the water. But yeah, if you're afraid to get into the water because you might walk out with a fourth leg,
right.
That have a negative effect on tourism. So it sounds like a lot of collaboration, a lot of communication. But so in order since you all are sharing this watershed I guess what I'm trying to say is can you pass something to reduce, you want to have it X level of pollutants coming, but can you also make that effective for the others that share into that watershed or no?
Not immediately. We can change our regulations to make them harder and stricter. With the Chesapeake Bay kind of watershed group and regulatory structure, everyone has a baseline they need to meet. Some states and jurisdictions go above that baseline. Some people just stay there.
Right.
And, DC, because of our truncated system, we like to push that envelope. We like to say, okay, we're doing all this research. We're looking at climate change. We're looking at sustainability. Do we need to increase our detention requirements, increase our retention requirements? How much of a difference is that going to make? And so we also push our partners to also look at that research, right? So within the Chesapeake Bay, we actually have a climate change work group where we look at studies on climate change and weather patterns and, looking at the weighing of meteorological, forecasts about what a future rain event could look like. And, that again, we also have to come to an agreement about what that information is. And so that's, a challenge. That's a negotiation that happens on a monthly basis between the folks on that work group. And also with the jurisdictions, internal environmental group, right? So for DC, when there's a decision that needs to be made on the watershed level, all of us in the DC office kind of get together and say, hey, what is everyone's opinion on changing some parameter or metric? And, we all weigh the pros and cons. Sometimes it's easy. We're all in consensus within our own office. Sometimes we're not. And then we usually internally debate it and then report back to the watershed partners and say, this is what DC's stance is on changing this metric.
It sounds like countless hours of research going into it. So I know you mentioned that, climate change is a big, I guess, not variable, but, a variable or something you pay close attention to see how, pollutants can affect future climate change, but are also like kind of what we mentioned, maybe increasing population in those areas, tourism. Are those numbers also looked at when you guys are looking into these maybe new thresholds?
So, DC, District of Columbia is landlocked. So we don't, our confined space is a blessing and a curse. Virginia and Maryland have to look at like population growth and infrastructure development when they expand the suburbs, for instance, for example. In DC, there's a lot of infill development. And so our stormwater infrastructure is typically already established. Our sanitary sewer system is typically established. So we don't kind of have to think about population growth so much, because when it comes to construction, we'll see it, right? And they'll have to meet the stormwater regulations when they come in for construction permitting. So the population growth, we're great. We'd be happy to see more people move to DC because that means more construction permits.
Yeah,
more stormwater practices, and so we'd see, a benefit to both worlds there, right? Like city, population, quality of life, water bodies being cleaner. It's,
it's a win-win across the board. DC is an interesting place. It is. I mean, I was there. We actually have a client out there. We work with the DDOT out there, and it's interesting. I like going there. It's a beautiful place to visit. So, it's funny. I was looking at the questions for today's podcast, and I was like, man, there's a lot of good topics, and I'm like, there's no way we're getting through all these, because I was like, I'm going to get us off track. And, this has been a great, conversation about the Chesapeake Bay. I wanted to get into the water reuse, which maybe I'll bring you on for another episode. But what I wanted to kind of, we've been talking about, I guess, some pretty serious, in-depth positions and things like that. But I kind of like to have some fun with the guests as well when they come on. And, you kind of spoke at the beginning about your path into engineering. So let's say you go back to your high school for senior career day.
Yeah.
And someone walks up to you and says, Ms. Bautista, I'm thinking of going into engineering, but I'm not sure, could you give me some advice of, am I going to have a lot of different options when I get out? Is my days going to be the same every day? What are you going to tell that high school senior?
Oh man, when you're young and you're 17 and you're, young and 16 really, right? Because you were applying for college at that time. The world is really your oyster. You kind of have to think expansively. And if I were to go back to my high school, I would probably, talk to the students who were on the fence. I would want to know what their skill set is at that time. When I was in high school, I thought history was my thing, but I really did well in math and AP math and all of my math courses. I was not good at chemistry. Please do not look at my chemistry grades, but that should have been a really good indicator to me that possibly I could have gone into kind of a math-based field, or at least take a look into it. I think one of the things that I like to do is actually, when I get reached out in LinkedIn and people say, hey, I looked at your profile and I like, you really got an interesting background, can we sit and chat or have coffee or have a virtual meeting? I'm always open to it, because I think just understanding where people are in their kind of progression of education is good. And then, when someone says, I want to go into civil engineering, is that going to be fun or is that going to be boring? And I was like, oh, you can make it whatever you want. Right. So I have colleagues who, work for Chevron, but for sustainability. I have colleagues who work in water and sanitation in developing countries, building composting toilets, right? So, you could do so much, or you could go into roadway design and work for a DOT or work for a consultant doing that. One of my previous jobs before coming to DC, I was an environmental scientist in Colorado. Wow. And I actually delineated wetlands, like in Aspen and in Vail for roadway.
Horrible places to be.
Right. And it was wonderful. I got to learn so much about kind of the environment there and how, the engineers interact with, the natural environment and roadway design, and what are we trying to protect, what are we what do we need to do to implement construction of a roadway because of the population demand there, right? So you can take it wherever you want to go. So that's what I would probably want to tell the student, that go into engineering. Do not work yourself to the bone, because you could do that later in life. College is one place you need to learn, but you also need to realize what makes you passionate. And by choosing a diverse course, list is really important, I think, in my opinion. Another thing that I found really vital to my engineering education is that when I pursued my master's in environmental engineering, and I'm going to do a shout out to my alumni in my university. I went to Stanford. I got very lucky and went to Stanford for civil and environmental engineering, but they require you to do a public speaking course or writing for the basically writing for non-technical audiences, which I think was so great. It's so helpful when you come to this point in your career where people are like, explain this concept to me. I have no clue what you're doing. And so you just go back and you tap into that kind of knowledge base that you created when you were in university, and you say, oh, okay, how do I need to speak to folks who are not engineers, who are not, who are just, Joe, Bill, or Susie, who are doing a construction project, what needs to happen and how do I need to communicate that? And so I always suggest people take a diverse course list when they go to university, because there's so many things to learn that can apply to your field that you would not know.
I agree. That's some great advice. And one thing that you touched on that makes complete sense is, like, you're right. Sometimes when you're trying to explain something to someone, you're not talking to another subject matter expert or a technical person, so you're going to lose them.
Yeah.
So especially in engineering, you can get in such technical talk, and you've got these other people in there be like, I got no clue. They're probably thinking about what they're going to have for lunch.
Right.
So
As a stormwater engineer, if I say curve number reduction, people are like, I don't know. I'm going to walk away.
You lost me already on that. So
yeah,
I definitely want to have you back. But as we spoke earlier before we started the podcast, you're from LA.
Yes.
And you moved all the way across from the, city of sunshine to the Big Apple. So I'm sure while you lived in LA, and I could be wrong, but I'm willing to go on a limb and say you probably did. Did you enjoy an In-N-Out burger?
I have many times. It's definitely one thing that I miss.
Okay. So now that you're living on the East Coast, there's a place called, I think it's Shake Shack.
Yes.
And people on the East Coast, they love it. Oh, In-N-Out has nothing on Shake Shack. So I always put engineers on the spot that have had both. If you had to choose In-N-Out, Shake Shack burger, where are you going?
Oh. In-N-Out.
Oh, there. See, this means you're coming back for another episode.
And In-N-Out is in Texas now. So I did my master's in urban planning at the University of Texas in Austin.
Oh, wow.
When I go back there, I get to go to In-N-Out. Yeah.
It's one of the first things I do as soon as I step foot off of a plane. I live in Ohio, and I tell people on In-N-Out, they think I'm nuts. But recently, two of the people from the office, they went out to LA and they tried it, and they were like, holy cow, this is a good burger.
Right. And it's so close to the airport.
Oh, it's just like... Now I'm getting hungry. So, Julienne, I appreciate you coming out and talking about the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. I look forward to having you back so we can kind of go over some of the other topics, because there were a lot of great topics that I think the audience would love to get into. I'd love to talk about how you, how you approach or not approach, but talk to people on a non-technical level to ensure that, they're understanding or they can kind of see the overall picture. There's water reuse that we want to talk about. So you're definitely going to be back as long as you'd like to come back.
Yeah, definitely. This was fun. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome. To everyone else out there, enjoy the week. And Julienne, thank you so much for coming on and spending some time with us.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Have a great day.
You as well.
All right.